She said it like she was daring me to flinch, eyes cold, voice sharper than the edge of the salon mirror. That's why I spit in your juice before serving you every morning. My world didn't shatter all at once. It cracked in the most humiliating way, with a half smirk on her face and the faint smell of hairspray still hanging in the air. I'd come to that salon hoping for a conversation, a confrontation, maybe, but one with dignity. Instead, my wife handed me the truth like it was a joke. And maybe it would have stayed that, a sick joke, a twisted little confession, if something inside me hadn't snapped. That day, I didn't yell. I didn't throw things. I just went home, walked into our bathroom, and replaced her favorite shampoo with a bottle full of white glue. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, let me thank you for your continuous support. If you love stories like this one, support us by subscribing to this channel and comment where you are watching us from. It will be great to hear from you. Now let's jump into the details of what happened. I introduced myself the way men who've been hurt for a long time do, quietly, with the small, unremarkable facts that make up the scaffold of a life. I was 38, I managed inventory for a mid-sized beverage distributor, and I kept my world organized on spreadsheets and in tidy habits. The morning coffee measured, the email inbox scanned by 8. The same old denim jacket hung on the same hook when I came home. In front of the stylists, in front of anyone who'd listen, felt like a brand. When I confronted her, it was with a voice that tried to be gentle and failed. I said, "You humiliate me in public. You call me names. You make jokes that cut." She bristled, the old smile twisting into white-hot anger. Her response when her face went cold and raw was the thing that broke me into pieces. "That's why I spit in your juice before serving you every morning." The sentence fell like a stone into the shallow pool of our life. I could feel the ripples, disgust, betrayal, the slow, shuddering humor of knowing someone you loved actively desecrated your breakfast. It sounds absurd when you write it down. The image of the woman I'd married leaning over a bottle and contaminating the coffee I'd been trusting like a small ritual. But she said it like it was currency, and I had always counted on us to be honest about the small stuff. When she finished, her eyes were sharp, triumphant. "You should know what I think of you," she said. It was not a throwaway line. It was a confession meant to wound, and it worked. I left the salon without having said what I really felt because words did not seem like enough. They never had been. Saying "don't do that" felt childish. Saying "you hurt me" felt insufficient. There was a strange clarity that followed her admission, that privacy had been violated deliberately and repeatedly at the level of the intimate. "Spit in my juice." The phrase was a pinprick that burned in a place you could not show on your skin. So I made a choice I could not have predicted then I would make. I did not call a lawyer. I did not move out. I did not yell or threaten. I went home and stood in our bathroom with the fluorescent lights turning our faces into unfamiliar maps, and I replaced her shampoo. I did not plan it with clinical detail. I made a single, human decision to give her a small public reckoning that mirrored the petty desecration she'd inflicted on me. I told myself it was proportional, that she would see the mirror of her own cruelty and feel small and understood. I would not tell you exactly how I did it, because a story like this should not be a how-to. I did what I thought would be harmless enough to show her what it felt like to be humiliated and exposed, and yet pointed enough to be remembered. After that, I went to bed with my heart pounding loud enough to keep me awake and an odd, queasy triumph gluing my ribs together. I did not sleep well. I kept rehearsing scenes in my head. The look on her face, the way she would finally have to account for the things she did. Somewhere in my mind, that rehearsing did something dangerous. It made me believe the satisfaction would be immediate and complete. Instead, it wound a thread that would pull at everything that followed. I had step 1. I had made my move. Step 2, as I imagined it, would be her realization and the world tipping back into balance. That was the setup. I had not yet imagined the twist, the confession she would make that was petty in a different register, tiny cruelties that cut like splinters, and that would change how I held my anger. I had not imagined the collateral damage. The chapter closed with her arriving home later that night, humming a song she had always loved, the same tune she used when everything was fine. As she opened the bottle to wash her hair, I watched from the doorway, feeling absurd, a voyeur to my own revenge, and she paused with the bottle halfway to her head. For a terrible moment, I tasted guilt, and for a terrible moment, I tasted something like triumph. The bottle slipped from her fingers. The sound it made when it hit the sink was the last ordinary noise I heard before everything shifted. I had imagined how she'd look, dumbfounded, apologetic, maybe a flicker of embarrassment that would soften her edge. Instead, she tossed back her head and laughed like someone who'd been waiting for the world to catch up with her long enough to make a scene. Her hair, at first, resisted, clinging in a damp, surprised mass. The bathroom smelled of citrus and chemical sweetness and a small metallic tang that, in hindsight, was the first warning I ignored because I wanted to be proven right more than I wished to be humane. She screamed then, a short, sharp sound that started as surprise and ended in fury. She blamed me before she had words to explain. What did you do? And for the first time, I felt the deep tremor of consequence. I had wanted her to feel small. I hadn't wanted her to be injured. I had not wanted the sound of her voice to splinter the woodwork of the house. She accused me in a shower of words that were, oddly, more ordinary and petty than I had expected. You never listen, she said between curses. You think the world is yours. You check the coffee can like it's a ledger. You count things. The irony of her calling me a counter of things was almost funny. She accused me of being childish, of exacting revenge like a schoolyard bully, and in the heat of it, I told myself she deserved it. But anger is a slippery companion, and the deeper I was pushed, the more I noticed the small things, the little ways she had undermined me, the petty cruelties that had been woven into our life like a second language. Those came out in flashes, offhand comments to my mother about my job, a forwarded email that was not supposed to reach me, a public critique at a friend's dinner where she joked about my stinginess. Each revelation cut in a different place. And then Lena spoke the words that became the mirror and the twist at once. As she stood there in the towel, hair clumped and defeated, she said something that stopped me like a breath held too long underwater. She told me, in a voice that was both ashamed and perversely proud, that she had been doing other things. Things that were petty and, at first blush, almost laughable. I pinched a little of your paycheck last month when I filled out the bills, she said. I steered your mother to gossip so she'd think less of you. I let your coffee sit a little too long sometimes. I'd hide your car keys when you were late and laugh in the other room. I'd spit in your glass because it made me feel powerful. It was a confession designed to be a wound as much as a revelation. It zigzagged and returned to places you had thought you resolved. Every small admission from Lena rewired what I thought the stakes were. It was no longer enough to get even. Getting even would have me sliding down to where she had been all along. The thing I wanted, quiet vindication, evaporated the more I learned. Instead, I started to see the problem as systemic. Both of us had become petty. Both of us had weaponized hurt. The chapter ended in the kind of small, public escalation I had feared. Lena posted a photograph on social media that night, smiling, hair immaculate, with the caption, "Bad hair day? Not today." The comments were a chorus, half congratulatory, half catty, and someone, inevitably, tagged a friend with the note. Remember what he did? LOL. I watched from the kitchen as the likes rose, an impersonal scoreboard I had accidentally started. The like count felt like a public judgment, and it was worse than any private argument. I had wanted to make her feel small. Instead, I had dragged our private rot into a place where it would be chewed up by strangers. The phone buzzed, and I saw a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was tight, worry threaded through her words. What happened? She asked. That was the escalation. My private revenge had become a spectacle. I had wanted a lesson. I had gotten a scene. After the voicemail, my pulse was loud enough that I could not ignore it. My mother's voice, always calibrated somewhere between concern and control, carried on the line the way family does, a small, persistent pressure. She wanted to know details, and I gave her none. I found myself in the odd situation of defending my revenge to the woman who had raised me to be polite and decent, and in defending it, I said more than I should. She said she spat in my juice. I told my mother, and her silence after that was a slow, bewildered thing. You could almost hear her recalculating the image she had of her son. The voicemail became a hinge. It gave my action a wider broadcast. What I had once thought would be a private, poetic retribution slid into being a narrative people would take sides on. Voices accumulated, as they always do, on the internet and in family group texts and in awkward hallway conversations at work. Lena did not retreat. If anything, her face hardened into a strategy. She recruited friends into an alliance of outrage that comforted her with shared scorn. I received texts from people I barely knew, friends of friends, saying things like, "You went too far," or "That's not funny." At work, people asked me in that halting voice you use when you want to be tactful about another scandal. My manager, a stoic woman who had always admired my reliability, asked me in the hallway if everything was okay at home. I lied by omission. I said, "We're working it out," which was both true and a lie. The confrontation with Lena intensified into something physically public. Marcy, emboldened by gossip and the heroic certainty of an aunt with a microphone, organized a small dinner to talk things through. She invited friends under the thin pretext of support for Lena, but made sure that the room would be full of witnesses. I arrived because I had always been the person who showed up, because even when my pride was in shreds, I could not refuse the demand for civility. The dinner was a stage. Lena sat at one end of the long table, immaculate and cool, and I sat at the other, my jaw tight, a place setting in front of me like a tiny accusation. Words flew. People offered opinions like currency. Someone joked about revenge porn, and someone else made a quip about marital therapy. It was absurd and terrible at once. The private agony of our marriage handled like a dinner party anecdote. Lena told the assembled friends the story of the salon, exaggerating, adding color, letting her version of events dominate the chorus. She told them about the spit, and then she said with a half-smile that she had sometimes hidden his shoes when she wanted him to feel anxious. I felt a peculiar, humorless pride that I had found a way to shake her. Then guilt rose up like bile, because the whole thing was out there to be judged. The voicemail from my mother had opened a fracture that widened with every retelling. I found myself on the defensive at work, at dinner, in texts. Friends I thought would be neutral picked a side with the casual cruelty of spectators at a fight. The more people watched, the less I felt entitled to my own feelings. The moral calculus was no longer private. Lena posted pictures with captions that framed me as the petty ex, and comments below cheered her like a queen returning from battle. I received a message from an ex-colleague who said, "Saw your wife's post. Man, that sucks." The pity in his words felt like salt. At the same time, Lena's confessions kept unspooling in private moments that made everything worse. In the heat of a subsequent argument, after the dinner had left a residue of awkwardness in the air, she said more things. "I've slept with the idea of leaving you sometimes," she said. "I talk to other men who make me feel different." It was not a confession of infidelity. It was a confession of emotional distance. Those words landed hard. They changed the texture of the argument from petty revenge to existential threat. If she had been practicing small cruelties because she felt small, she was now telling me that she had been lifting her eyes to other lives, other possibilities. That realization, which might have galvanized some men into jealousy and action, instead made me colder. I had always imagined that if she had been unfaithful, I would rise in a classical drama of righteous wrath. But knowing that she had been emotionally elsewhere rendered my revenge small and childish. I saw then that what I had sought to punish, a singular humiliation, was actually a symptom of a larger rot. My act of replacing her shampoo felt, in the light of that confession, like throwing a rock at a crumbling wall and expecting it to rebuild itself. The voices around us, friends, family, social media, had made us into caricatures. There was less room for tenderness, for repair, and more room for sides to be taken. The chapter closed with me listening to another voicemail on my phone, this one from Lena. She had left it after the dinner, anger simmering into a tone that made me feel both triumphant and trapped. "You wanted to teach me a lesson," she said. "Now everybody will know we're broken." Her voice cracked, and there was, finally, a sliver of humidity at the edge of her words. That tiny softness landed in me like an anchor. I realized that storm or no storm, the life we had built might not survive the weather. And that realization frightened me more than the knowledge of her petty cruelties or my own vindictive act ever had. The social aftermath was the most jagged part. People chose sides with the same careless cruelty with which they comment under viral videos. I watched as acquaintances who had never known our home life offered legal advice and moral certainty. Lena's friends circulated a version of the story that turned me into the villain of a short morality play, and people I thought were neutral messaged me with instructions on how to apologize. I learned how quickly reputations were rewritten, how quickly nuance evaporated. At the same time, the more the world watched, the more my private shame calcified into something I could not explain away. There were practical consequences. The company where I managed inventory had to deal with the question of whether someone's private misjudgments reflected on their professional competence. My manager pulled me aside and asked if I needed time off. HR, bland and bureaucratic, suggested mediation. My mother sent a check to help with therapy, and I threw it in a drawer unopened. Lena's phone collected new followers. My phone gathered thin, sympathetic messages. The ground felt unstable. And then came the public fallout that, in a sense, I had invited. One afternoon, at a community event where both of us were due to speak, on different panels, because we led adjacent charity initiatives, I felt the weight of eyes that had already heard the story. Lena arrived looking composed. I watched her from the back of the room as she moved through the crowd with the graceful arrogance of someone who had been rehearsed by pain into performative poise. She smiled at our friends, and then, in the middle of her speech, she made a line that stung. Sometimes people do things to each other to prove they can be cruel. It wasn't an accusation aimed at me, and yet everyone there knew what she meant. The applause was perfunctory, and I felt like a man in a slow-motion scene where he had already been judged. The domestic fallout was worse. We could not sleep in the same bed without finding ways to avoid each other. We started to live parallel lives under the same roof, sharing a bathroom schedule and keeping conversations to the brevity of receipts and logistics. The small rituals that used to stitch us together, grocery shopping, the shared joke over a mug, became minefields. I found myself replacing my morning routine with silent anger. I measured out my coffee in a way that felt ritualistic, half to protect myself and half to remind myself that I still had agency. Marcy, bless her, kept trying to be the mediator, but her mediation came with the implacable moralism of a woman who had never been tempted by revenge. She told Lena, more than once, to apologize. She told me, in a private conversation, that revenge never felt good. Her words had the strange power of being both true and insufficient. They were honest, her puritanical insistence that the moral high ground was where you started and ended, but they did not ease the way I felt. People wrote letters of support. People turned away. The house hummed with small contests of power that looked ridiculous to any outsider and enormous to anyone living inside. Then, quite unexpectedly, an escalation occurred that I had not foreseen. Lena lost her job. It wasn't a direct consequence of my actions, but of the public narrative that had taken shape, the whispered conversations at the salon, the sotto voce comments at her workplace. The nonprofit where she worked had board members who hated messy headlines. She was let go for conduct unbecoming, a catch-all that meant little and took everything. Watching the way her world contracted in the days after the firing forced me to see the gravity of what I had set into motion. The world had not punished only Lena for her small cruelties. It had punished our entire life. She came home one night with a small cardboard box, her desk items. And for a second, when she stood in the doorway with the box in her arms, I saw her as someone stripped bare, not someone triumphant. Something in me wanted to gloat, to point at the cause and effect. But when Lena put the box down, she sat on the couch, and we talked in the kind of low, exhausted voices you use when grief is not yet named. She told me, softly, about the precise moment they called her into HR, and how they had seemed more interested in avoiding headlines than in listening to nuance. That was when the landscape of culpability shifted in my mind. We were both complicit, yes, but the fallout had moved us from petty fights to actual damage. I had wanted her to feel small. Instead, the world made her small in a way that left scars. The thought made my inclusive triumph sour. The chapter closed with an unanticipated act. Lena left a note on the kitchen counter. It was not a page-long diatribe, not a surrender. It was a single sentence. I am sorry you felt I did that, but I will not be controlled into shame. The ambiguity, apology fused with defiance, was the worst kind. It told me nothing and everything. I read it 3 times and then smoothed my hand over the words, feeling the papery proof that whatever I had hoped to achieve by punishing her had unraveled into something neither of us could easily reweave. Sitting alone on the porch that night, I felt like a man who had built a fire to warm himself and then realized the sparks had set the roof alight. The embers of our old life flickered in my memory. The way Lena had once laughed at the absurdity of my neatness. The way I had found solace in being the reliable one. I remembered early days, me making a sandwich absent-mindedly while she read aloud from a paperback, the ridiculous affection we exchanged over small dinners. Those days were not gone so much as sedimented beneath the weight of petty offenses and small betrayals that neither of us had thought would matter. Lena, in a late-night conversation that was more like an unspooling than a catharsis, told me more things she had hidden. They were petty, yes, and in their pettiness they were oddly vulnerable. She admitted to altering small financial entries when the bills embarrassed her, to exaggerating my missteps to friends to feel less alone in her dissatisfaction, to writing a fake comment on my social media to see how I'd react. Each admission was a small stone in the mosaic of her loneliness. She had performed tiny cruelties because she felt unseen, and she wanted, perversely, to be noticed, even if by the sting of being noticed. When I heard it, something softened in me. The stage of victim and avenger rearranged into a more complicated map, 2 damaged people using small harms to ask for recognition. I had revenge, and I had seen its effects. The triumph I had imagined dissolved into a complex ache. Lena's job loss, the comments, the social fragmentation, none of it compensated me for the moral cost I had paid. I had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt messy, tired, and irrevocably changed. I realized, finally, that standing firm in boundaries did not mean lashing out. Boundaries could be enforced without building a trap of my own making. The thought was both simple and revolutionary. I wanted to be a man who held his ground with dignity, who refused to be degraded without matching that degradation with more. So I did what seemed nearly impossible. I reached for honesty. I sat at the kitchen table with Lena and told her, without flourish, what had happened. I did not dramatize how I had replaced her shampoo. I said I had done it to make her feel the humiliation I had felt when she admitted she'd spit in my juice. I did not excuse it. I said I was sorry. She listened, and when she spoke it was with a new kind of clarity. She said she had done what she did not because she wanted to hurt me, but because she felt diminished and wanted to feel powerful for a moment. She told me, too, of the way she had watched me shrink when others laughed at my expense, and how that made her feel like she had to assert a place in our life. There was no cinematic forgiveness. There was no cinematic reconciliation. But there was a new map, an agreement to go to therapy, to stop weaponizing small cruelties, to be accountable for the micro-acts that compound into a ruin. It was imperfect and frightened. The twist, Lena's admitted pettiness, had cut me open, but it had also become the conduit for something like honesty. We both owned our parts. We both felt ashamed. We both wanted, in half-light and in the way of long marriages, to salvage something. The chapter closed with an odd, decisive moment that felt like the hinge of all that came after. After our talk, Lena reached into the carton of cartons in the hall and pulled out a small envelope. She opened it, slid a thin sheet of paper to me, and on it she had written a list, things I did that I am ashamed of. It read like a confession and a promise. There were no melodramatic acts of fidelity or grand vows, only small, honest admissions and a commitment to change. Underneath, in a shaky hand, she had written, "I will learn to ask, not to wound." When I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, I felt like a man who had been given both a map and a warning. The warning was to be careful with how I used the map. Months passed with the slow, patient work of repair. We went to therapy not as a theatrical gesture, but as a manual practice in learning to ask for things we needed without using cruel tools. Lena found a new job, quieter and less public, where her talents for connecting with people were valued without the glare of a boardroom. I learned to let go of the petty inventory of slights I'd kept like a talisman. We set new boundaries that were pragmatic. No public mocking, no secret sabotage, no anonymous jibes. Mostly we committed to a new language. If something hurt us, we would name it in a conversation, not in an anecdote at a gathering. There were relapses. Once, in the middle of a family lunch, a cousin made a joke about my tendency to be methodical. Lena laughed. It was an automatic reflex, and my hand clenched. I felt an old hunger for theatrical revenge rise up, but then I remembered the cardboard box, the social fallout, the voicemail. I put down my fork and, in the kindest voice I could find, said, "That stung." We talked, briefly, and Lena apologized to me across the table, and the apology carried weight because it was immediate, not performative. The revenge had taught me something uncomfortable, that acting like the hurt person could slide you into the same moral mud as the one who hurt you. The satisfaction I had craved in humiliating her had been real, but it had not lasted. It had been a quick, bitter taste. The long work was to stand firm in my boundaries without returning to the petty practices that had started the spiral. I learned to say no, to walk out of conversations that degraded me, to refuse the role of the punchline. I became, slowly, someone who could protect his dignity without forcing the other person into degradation as a lesson. In the end, the revenge did not feel like victory. It felt like a costly experiment, a lesson I had to pay for. Lena and I did not return to the naive, unexamined love we had shared. We rebuilt a different thing, less theatrical, less performative, more honest. We had hard conversations and small acts of repair. She made me coffee and offered it without us negotiating humiliation. I learned to be less rigid about my routines and to, sometimes, let the little annoyances slide. There was a redemptive impulse near the end, small and human. A day when Lena, in passing, massaged my shoulders and said, "I'm sorry I made you small." I accepted the apology the way you accept a bandage for a long healing wound, grateful, but careful. When I think back now, I stand firm in a decision that was not simple. I had wanted to teach a lesson, and I did. But the lesson expanded into a much larger and harsher education about what it means to retaliate. I had crossed a line, and it taught me to redraw my boundaries not as traps, but as guardrails. I learned that the desire for vengeance can be a teacher if you let it instruct you to be kinder to yourself rather than cruel to others. I kept my dignity not by making her small, but by choosing to refuse small cruelty as currency. That, I finally understood, was the real revenge on cruelty, to live on your own terms, whole and uncompromised, without replicating the ugliness you condemn. If this story landed hard with you, if you felt the sting of petty cruelties or the ache of revenge that didn't heal, tell me in the comments about one small boundary you had to set and how it changed things. Share this if it made you think about how we hurt one another in private and what it costs us when we let spectacle replace conversation.